Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Middle Ages. Everyone skips over the awkward parts, the unglamorous parts, and the things that were so normal back then, nobody thought to write them down, which is honestly rude of them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. One of the biggest lies we tell ourselves about medieval people is that they stayed put. Born in one village, died in the same bed, never leaving the comforting radius of the local cow. In reality, medieval life was less rooted in farming communities and more a permanent state of low-energy relocation. People moved constantly, usually not because they wanted to, but because something had gone horribly wrong. Crops failed, lords raised rents, and armies marched through, ate everything, and left behind the medieval equivalent of a sorry about that note written in hoofprints. When this happened, peasants didn't complain. Complaining was dangerous. They packed. And by packed, I mean they grabbed whatever wasn't nailed down, argued over whether the cooking pot was worth carrying, and walked, not toward opportunity, but toward maybe this place is slightly less cursed. Seasonal work added to the chaos. Harvest time pulled labourers across entire regions. Religious festivals triggered mass human migration, as thousands of people decided that walking for weeks to stand in a field and pray was a perfectly reasonable vacation plan. Pilgrimages were popular because nothing says spiritual growth like blistered feet and food poisoning. Travel itself was an experience. Roads were mud. Mud was everywhere. In winter you sank. In summer you choked on dust. Signposts were rare. Maps were optimistic lies. Getting lost wasn't an accident. It was the default setting. And yet, people kept going. Because staying could be worse. If your lord suddenly remembered you existed and wanted more taxes, walking away might save your life. Medieval society liked to pretend people were legally bound to land forever. Reality quietly disagreed. Villages became revolving doors of humanity. New faces arrived. Old ones vanished. Nobody asked too many questions, because tomorrow they might be the ones leaving under cover of darkness with a sack of grain and a growing sense of regret. Even gossip travelled faster than official news. A merchant with loose morals and a loud voice could spread rumours across half a kingdom faster than a royal messenger who actually knew what he was doing. So medieval people weren't static peasants trapped in time. They were tired, mobile survivors, constantly walking away from problems, usually straight into new ones. History draws borders. Medieval people walked right over them, slowly complaining the entire way. Romance in the medieval world was heartfelt, emotional, and frequently outsourced. Because while people were deeply capable of falling in love, most of them were not capable of writing it down. Literacy was rare, expensive, and mostly reserved for clergy, nobles, and that one guy in town who wouldn't stop correcting everyone. So when medieval people wanted to express affection, devotion, or uncontrollable longing, they hired a professional, a scribe, a clerk, or sometimes a monk. Nothing kills the mood like whispering your deepest feelings to a man who has sworn celibacy and is judging your grammar. Picture the scene. You enter a small room that smells like ink, parchment, and quiet disappointment. You clear your throat and say something like, I need a letter, a love letter. The scribe nods calmly, dips his quill and asks, "How intense are we talking?" Then comes the confession. You dictate your feelings out loud slowly and carefully, while another human being writes down every word with the emotional distance of someone taking grocery notes. You say, "Tell her, my heart burns for her." The scribe pauses, looks up and asks, "Burns as in spiritually, or burns as in alarming?" And of course, there were standards. Medieval love letters followed formal structures. There were opening praises, emotional declarations, vows of loyalty, and dramatic flourishes borrowed from classical texts. If you weren't eloquent enough, the scribe would help. Would you like to compare her beauty to the dawn, the rose, or divine light? This was not optional. Romance had formatting rules, and even better, the scribe often knew both parties. Small towns didn't offer anonymity. Your love letter might be written by someone who baptized your crush, taught her cousin to read, and absolutely knew she was already engaged. Professional discretion was encouraged. Professional silence was hopeful. Sometimes scribes reused phrases, not intentionally, but when you write dozens of love letters a year, patterns happen. Somewhere out there, two medieval lovers received suspiciously similar compliments and never compared notes. And then there's delivery. Letters were carried by messengers, friends, or whoever owed you a favour. There was no privacy seal beyond wax and trust. Anyone handling it could read it, laugh, or memorise your romantic desperation for later entertainment. Yet somehow, despite all this, medieval love letters worked. People married, affairs happened, hearts were broken, love survived quills, witnesses reused metaphors, and monks had opinions. Romance wasn't private, it wasn't discreet, but it was sincere even when dictated. And that might be the most medieval thing of all. In medieval society, being left-handed wasn't a harmless quirk. It was a red flag, a warning sign, a gentle suggestion from the universe that something about you was off. And by off, medieval people meant possibly cursed, morally suspicious, or one bad day away from witchcraft. The problem started with symbolism. The Latin word for left is sinister, which should tell you everything you need to know. Right-handedness was associated with order, righteousness, and divine favour. Left-handedness, meanwhile, was linked to chaos, deception, and doing things the wrong way. Literally, if you reach for something with your left hand, someone nearby probably frowned and quietly reconsidered trusting you. Left-handed children were often corrected early, and by corrected I mean actively trained out of it. Teachers, parents, and religious figures encouraged right-hand use for writing, eating, praying, and basically existing. If you stubbornly favoured your left hand, it wasn't seen as a preference. It was seen as defiance, or worse, influence. Even daily rituals reinforced this bias. People crossed themselves with their right hand. Oaths were sworn with the right hand raised. Important actions happened on the right side. Doing something left-handed felt wrong in a way that was both social and spiritual. Medieval logic concluded that if the devil existed and everyone agreed he did, he probably favoured the left. Left-handed knights had it especially rough. Sword training assumed right-handed combat. A left-handed fighter confused opponents, which sounds like an advantage until you realise your own instructors didn't like it. Being unpredictable was suspicious. Being effective while unpredictable was even worse. Medical theory didn't help either. Medieval scholars believed the body was divided into moral halves. The right side was strong, warm and noble. The left side was weaker, colder, and prone to imbalance. If something went wrong physically, the left side was often blamed, because of course it was. Despite all this, left-handed people persisted. They worked, fought, wrote, cooked, and survived quietly using the hand that felt natural. Many simply learned to switch in public and revert in private, a medieval version of code switching but for hands. So if you were left-handed in the Middle Ages, congratulations. You weren't evil, you weren't cursed. You were just living in a world deeply offended by your coordination. History has many villains. Sometimes it turns out one of them was the left hand. In the medieval world, self-awareness existed. Self-reflection did not, at least not visually. Because for most people, mirrors were rare, expensive, and wildly impractical. Which means the average medieval peasant went through life with only a vague, second-hand understanding of what their own face looked like. Glass mirrors were luxury items owned by nobles, monasteries, or that one suspiciously wealthy merchant who never explained where his money came from. Polished metal mirrors existed, but they were small, dull, distorted, and often showed you a version of yourself that looked like it had been lightly cursed. Imagine finally seeing your reflection and realizing you appear permanently annoyed and slightly melted. For most people, the closest thing to a mirror was water. Ponds, wells, buckets, or rivers offered fleeting glimpses, usually warped by ripples, shadows, or the sudden realization that you might fall in and die. You didn't linger. You glanced. You accepted whatever vague shape stared back and moved on. As a result, medieval people learned what they looked like through descriptions. Other people told them, not kindly, "You have your father's nose. Your eyes are too close together. You look tired." This was your mirror. Social feedback. Brutal, unfiltered, and unavoidable. This also meant personal grooming was approximate. Hairstyles were practical, not aesthetic. Beards were trimmed based on feel, not appearance. If your hair looked uneven, someone would eventually mention it loudly, publicly, and with unnecessary enthusiasm. The idea of checking your appearance before leaving the house simply didn't exist. You left the house and hoped for the best. If no one laughed immediately, you assumed things were fine. Confidence was easier when you had no visual proof otherwise. Portraits didn't help either. Most people never had one, and even when they did, medieval art wasn't aiming for realism. Artists focused on symbolism, not accuracy. A portrait might show you looking serene, noble, and symmetrical, none of which were guaranteed in real life. This disconnect between identity and appearance created a strange freedom. Medieval people weren't obsessed with how they looked because they literally couldn't be. Vanity required access. Access required money. Most people had neither. So medieval society judged you by your actions, your reputation, your family, and whether you smelled tolerable, not by your jawline or skin tone. In a world without mirrors, self-esteem was built on survival, not selfies. And honestly, that might be the most medieval flex of all. One of the strangest and least discussed facts about medieval life is how emotionally attached people were to their stuff, not in a modern consumerist way. There was no impulse buying, no seasonal upgrades, and no treat-yourself mentality. When you owned something in the Middle Ages, it was because you needed it, and chances were you would own it for most of your life. Naturally, people started giving these objects names. Tools were the most common candidates. A shovel wasn't just a shovel, it was the shovel. The one that helped you survive winters, dig fields, bury relatives, and occasionally threaten geese. When something does that much emotional labour, it earns a name. Axes, ploughs, knives, and even cooking pots were often referred to as if they were co-workers rather than property. Weapons were especially personal. Swords, daggers, and shields frequently had names, sometimes serious, sometimes oddly affectionate. A blade that had protected you in battle wasn't metal, it was a companion. Breaking it wasn't inconvenient, it was tragic. People didn't say, "My sword snapped." They said, "I lost him." But it didn't stop there. Ovens were named, doors were named, bells were named. If an object was central to daily survival, it crossed the line from tool to personality. An oven that baked good bread was praised. One that failed was insulted loudly and repeatedly in front of others. This wasn't superstition. It was practicality mixed with exhaustion. When your entire life depended on a handful of objects functioning properly, you developed relationships with them. You spoke to them. You blamed them. You thanked them. Medieval people lived close to the edge, and anthropomorphizing a shovel was healthier than screaming into the void. There was also a legal side. Named objects appeared in wills. I leave my good knife to my eldest son. Not just any knife, the good one. Everyone knew which one that meant. Objects carried memory, reputation, and history. Losing them was losing a piece of identity. Even repairs carried emotional weight. A patched tool wasn't inferior. It was experienced. Scars meant reliability. A tool that had been fixed a dozen times had proven it deserved to stay. In a world with very few possessions, each one mattered. So medieval people didn't just own objects, they lived with them, worked with them, and sometimes cursed them like old friends who refused to cooperate. Honestly, naming your shovel makes a lot of sense when your shovel is the reason you're still alive. In the medieval world, shoes were not fashion. They were not accessories. They were not something you casually owned 3 pairs of just in case. Shoes were survival equipment, and losing a shoe was less oops and more this might actually ruin my year. Leather was expensive. Skilled labour was expensive. Everything involved in making shoes required time, animals, and a cobbler who probably had strong opinions and limited patience. As a result, most people owned exactly 1 pair of shoes. 1. And those shoes were expected to endure fields, mud, stones, animal waste, winter frost, summer heat, and whatever mysterious liquids medieval streets offered without explanation. So instead of replacing shoes, people repaired them constantly. Soles were stitched, restitched, patched, layered, and reinforced until the original shoe was less footwear and more historical artifact. A medieval shoe could contain leather from 3 different animals, repairs from multiple decades, and enough stitching to qualify as a textile thesis. Cobblers were everywhere and deeply respected. Not glamorous, but essential. A good cobbler could extend the life of a shoe for years, sometimes decades. And if you found one who worked quickly and didn't judge you for the smell, you stayed loyal forever. Shoes were so valuable that they appeared in wills. Parents passed them down to children. Older siblings inherited shoes that had already seen too much. Breaking in new shoes wasn't painful because they were new. It was painful because they were someone else's old ones. And heaven help you if a shoe failed during winter. Bare feet on frozen ground weren't inconvenient. It was dangerous. Frostbite didn't care about your financial situation. So, people wrapped their feet in cloth, straw, or whatever material they could find until the cobbler could work his magic again. This also explains why medieval people walked the way they did, carefully and deliberately. Every step mattered. You didn't sprint unless chased by something worse than losing a shoe. You avoided puddles not for cleanliness, but for shoe preservation. In a world without cheap replacements, durability was everything. Shoes weren't discarded. They were managed, loved, maintained, and argued with. So when you picture medieval life, remember this. Those worn-out, misshapen shoes weren't signs of poverty. They were signs of responsibility. If your shoes lasted, you were doing something right. One quiet fear haunted medieval life more than war, famine, or even disease. Being forgotten, not dying. Dying was expected. Being erased. That was unbearable. In a world with no photographs, no recordings, and very little written documentation, memory was fragile. If no one remembered you, it was as if you had never existed, and medieval people were deeply uncomfortable with that idea. Eternity was long, reputation was short, the math didn't work. This is why people are obsessed over names. Children were named after parents, grandparents, saints, and occasionally that one uncle everyone agreed deserved another shot. Naming wasn't creative. It was archival. You weren't honouring someone. You were keeping them alive through repetition. Gravestones, when they existed, mattered enormously. Even the simplest marker, a carved symbol, a scratched name, a rough cross, was a declaration. I was here. I mattered enough to be remembered. If you couldn't afford stone, memory had to do the work instead. Stories became tombstones you carried in your head. This fear also explains why medieval people loved witnesses. Contracts were spoken aloud. Promises were made in groups. Events were public. If enough people saw something happen, it became real. If no one saw it, it might as well have never happened. Privacy wasn't romantic. It was risky. Church records existed partly for the same reason. Baptisms, marriages, and deaths are all carefully logged, not just for God, but for memory. Being written down meant permanence. Being unwritten meant vanishing quietly into the mud of history. Even medieval charity had a memory angle. Donating to a church often came with one request. Say my name in your prayers. That wasn't spiritual vanity. That was insurance. As long as someone spoke your name, you weren't gone. Ironically, this obsession worked. Centuries later, we still know the names of ordinary people because they were stubborn enough to leave marks, records, symbols, or stories behind. So medieval people didn't chase fame. They chased remembrance. They lived knowing their time was short, their world was unstable, and history was forgetful. And they fought that reality the only way they could, by making sure someone somewhere remembered their name, which is why you're hearing about them now. In the modern world, silence is marketed as a luxury. People buy noise-cancelling headphones, book silent retreats, and proudly announce that they just need some quiet. Medieval people, on the other hand, heard silence and immediately assumed something had gone terribly spiritually wrong. A silent medieval house was not peaceful. It was suspicious. Noise meant life. Talking, coughing, praying, animals shuffling, tools clanking. These were reassuring sounds. If a home went quiet, it suggested illness, death, or the presence of something that preferred you not notice it. And medieval people were very uncomfortable with things that preferred not to be noticed. This fear had religious roots. Silence was associated with the grave, the afterlife, and the unknown. Churches echoed on purpose, filling space with chanting, bells, and prayer. Bells rang constantly for timekeeping, warnings, celebrations, funerals, emergencies, and sometimes just because someone thought the silence was getting ideas. Homes followed the same logic. People talked while they worked, They sang while they cooked. They prayed out loud. Even alone, many people muttered to themselves, not because they were strange, but because being audibly present felt safer. Silence implied abandonment. Sound implied protection. At night, silence was especially dangerous. Darkness already belonged to spirits, demons, and theological anxiety. Add silence, and you had a perfect environment for imagining footsteps, whispers, or divine judgment creeping up behind you. A crackling fire, even a weak one, was comforting, not just for warmth, but for sound. That gentle noise reassured you that the world was still functioning. This also explains medieval group sleeping habits. People didn't just sleep together for warmth. They slept together because shared breathing, shifting, and occasional snoring created a soundscape that pushed back the void. A room full of noise meant no one had died quietly during the night, which was always a concern. Even monasteries famous for silence structured it carefully. Silence wasn't absence of sound. It was regulated, ritualized, and heavily supervised. Unplanned silence that was unsettling. To medieval ears, silence wasn't calm, it wasn't healing, and it wasn't restful. It was a warning. And in a world where danger was constant and explanations were limited, making noise was one of the easiest ways to feel alive. So if medieval people seemed loud, repetitive, or annoyingly chatty, remember they weren't filling space. They were keeping it away. In medieval society, hair wasn't just hair. It was a statement, a warning, a resume, and occasionally a problem that needed immediate spiritual intervention. What grew out of your head mattered far more than modern people would be comfortable with, because medieval culture believed hair carried meaning, moral, social, and sometimes supernatural. Long hair could signal power, freedom, or rebellion. It could also signal that you hadn't been properly punished yet. Knights wore their hair with intention. Nobles styled it to display status. Monks shaved it to prove devotion. And women's hair that was treated like a dangerous substance, best kept under control at all times. Loose hair on a woman was associated with sexuality, disorder, or emotional instability. Respectable women covered their hair not because it was cold, but because medieval society was deeply nervous about what might happen if it wasn't restrained. Hair escaping a veil was treated like a scandal in progress. Hair cutting itself was symbolic. Having your hair cut against your will was a punishment, a public removal of dignity. Criminals, prisoners, and disgraced individuals often had their hair shaved to mark shame. It wasn't just humiliation, it was identity theft. You didn't look like yourself anymore, and everyone knew why. Religious life took hair seriously too. Monks shaved the crown of the head in the famous tonsure, creating a bald circle that silently announced, "I belong to God." Now, this haircut required maintenance, which meant monks were constantly reshaving the same awkward bald spot just in case God was checking. Even beards carried meaning. A beard could symbolize wisdom, masculinity, or authority. Shaving one off could be an insult, a challenge, or an emotional declaration. Medieval men didn't shave casually. They shaved with intent. And then there was the fear of hair falling into the wrong hands. Hair could be used in charms, curses, or folk magic. People believed strands carried part of your essence. Losing hair wasn't cosmetic, it was risky. Throwing it away carelessly was an invitation for someone with bad intentions and too much free time. So medieval people guarded their hair, controlled it, shaped it, and judged others by it relentlessly. Hair wasn't decoration. It wasn't personal expression. It was power sitting on your scalp, daring you to manage it correctly. And if you didn't, someone would definitely have an opinion. Medieval people did not believe all days were created equal. Some days were blessed, productive, and spiritually cooperative. Others were suspicious, deeply suspicious. And if you did anything important on the wrong day, medieval logic concluded that whatever went wrong was entirely your fault for not checking the calendar first. These unlucky days weren't rare, they were everywhere. Certain weekdays, saints' days, feast days, fasting days, astrological alignments, and vague, traditionally bad dates were all considered dangerous for specific activities. There were days you should not marry, days you should not travel, days you should not bleed, days you should not plant crops, and days you should absolutely not cut your hair because apparently hair remembers things. Medical guides warned against procedures on the wrong days. If you were sick, it mattered when you sought treatment. Bleeding a patient on the wrong date wasn't just ineffective, it was reckless. Surgeons consulted calendars before touching you, which is comforting in theory until you realise the calendar was based on astrology, vibes, and inherited superstition. Farmers followed the same logic. Planting on an unlucky day risked poor harvests, storms, or divine disapproval. If crops failed later, no one blamed the weather, they blamed the date. Somewhere a calendar quietly nodded in judgment. Marriage was especially complicated. Choosing the wrong wedding day could doom a relationship before it even began. Couples delayed ceremonies for weeks to avoid cursed dates. Imagine explaining to your family that you love each other deeply, but the stars are currently unsupportive. Even travel had unlucky days. Setting out on the wrong morning meant accidents, bandits, broken carts, or mysterious misfortune. Some people would turn back if they experienced a bad omen, like tripping, sneezing, or hearing the wrong bird because clearly the universe was saying, "Not today." The irony is that this belief created its own consequences. When people expected bad outcomes, they noticed them more. A bad day became bad because everyone treated it like it was already ruined. Medieval self-fulfilling prophecy was thriving. Calendars became survival manuals. Knowing which days were safe meant control in an unpredictable world. If disaster struck, at least you could say, "Well, I warned you about that Tuesday." So medieval people didn't just plan their lives, they negotiated with time itself. And time, more often than not, was deeply unimpressed. In medieval times, a sneeze was not a minor inconvenience. It was an event, a moment, a potential spiritual emergency that required immediate verbal intervention from everyone nearby. Because to medieval people, sneezing wasn't just air leaving your body. It was your soul briefly considering an escape. The logic was simple and deeply unsettling. Sneezing created a moment of vulnerability. Your body convulsed, your breath stopped, your eyes closed, and for a split second you lost control. And any moment where you lost control was clearly an invitation for spirits, demons, or general bad luck to either leave you or move in. Medieval theology did not trust gaps. This is where blessings came in. Saying, "God bless you," wasn't politeness. It was damage control, a spoken seal. A quick spiritual lid slammed shut before anything invisible and malicious could take advantage of the situation. If no one blessed you after a sneeze, that was alarming. It meant your soul might be unsupervised. Sneezing during important moments was especially concerning. A sneeze during prayer is suspicious. A sneeze during a wedding is unfortunate. A sneeze while making a vow or signing a contract is potentially catastrophic. Some people would stop what they were doing entirely, wait for the moment to pass and only then continue because clearly the universe had tried to interrupt. Medical beliefs made it worse. Some medieval thinkers believed sneezing expelled air directly connected to the heart or brain. Too many sneezes meant weakness. Too few sneezes meant blockage. Sneezing the wrong way meant imbalance. Sneezing at the wrong time meant fate was speaking, and fate was rarely helpful. There were even interpretations based on direction. Sneezing to the right could be good. Sneezing to the left was questionable. Sneezing repeatedly meant something was very wrong, and possibly involved curses, drafts, or both. Children were warned not to sneeze carelessly, which is impressive because sneezing is famously easy to control. Parents scolded kids for not covering their mouths, not for hygiene, but because open sneezing increased spiritual exposure. Medieval parenting was wild, and yet sneezing was unavoidable. Everyone did it, which meant medieval life was filled with constant low-level anxiety that your nose might betray you at the worst possible moment. So when someone blessed you after a sneeze, it wasn't kindness, it was panic wrapped in courtesy. A medieval sneeze wasn't rude, it was risky. Medieval childhood was not a long, reflective phase filled with self-discovery, toys and carefully scheduled playdates. It was brief, brutally brief. In fact, medieval parents looked at a child and asked only one real question: can this small human be useful yet? If the answer was yes, congratulations. Welcome to the workforce. As soon as a child could walk without falling directly into a fire or a bucket, they were assigned tasks, small ones at first: fetching water, carrying sticks, and scaring birds away from crops by yelling enthusiastically and flailing their arms like confused scarecrows. None of this was seen as cruel. It was normal. A household was a survival unit, and everyone participated regardless of height. By the time a child reached what we would now call early childhood, they were already competent contributors. Boys and girls alike herded animals, gathered fuel, helped with planting, cleaned tools, watched siblings, and learned trades simply by being present while adults worked. Education wasn't separate from labour. Labour was education. There were no job interviews, no training programs, and no safety instructions. You learned by doing, by watching someone else do it, or by making a mistake and not making it again if you survived. Childhood injuries weren't milestones, they were lessons. Parents didn't romanticize childhood innocence because survival didn't allow for it. Love was expressed through teaching usefulness. A capable child was a protected child. If you could work, you were valuable. If you were valuable, you were fed. This didn't mean medieval parents were heartless. They worried constantly. They protected when they could. They told stories, sang songs, and laughed with their children in rare, quiet moments. But the expectation was clear. Childhood was preparation, not pause. Teenagers were already adults in practice. Many were apprenticed out, sent to other households, or working full days long before modern society would allow them near anything sharp. By their early teens, many medieval children were already tired in a way most modern adults would recognise. Play existed, but it was squeezed between responsibilities. Games involved sticks, stones, animals, or pretending to be someone important, which usually meant pretending not to be poor. So, medieval parents didn't ask their children what they wanted to be when they grew up. They asked what they could do today. And honestly, that expectation shaped generations of survivors, whether they liked it or not. In the medieval world, signing your name was not a basic life skill. It was a flex. literacy was rare, expensive, and mostly reserved for clergy, nobles, and that one irritating town official who insisted on reading things aloud slowly. For everyone else, identity worked a little differently. Instead of signatures, medieval people used symbols. When peasants, merchants, or craftsmen needed to confirm a contract, they didn't sign their name, they made a mark. A cross was the most common. But many people had personal symbols, simple shapes, lines, or marks they used consistently. That symbol was you. It carried legal weight. It said, "Yes, I agree." Even if you couldn't read a single word of what you were agreeing to, which, to be clear, happened constantly. Contracts were often read aloud by a clerk while everyone nodded solemnly, pretending to understand. Then you made your mark and hoped the nice man with the ink wasn't quietly transferring your cow, your land, and your dignity to someone else. These symbols weren't random. They became part of a person's identity. People recognized them the way we recognize signatures today. A familiar mark meant trust. A sloppy or unfamiliar one raised suspicion. Forging a mark was a crime, which is impressive considering the mark might just be a crooked line. Shop signs worked the same way since many people couldn't read. Businesses identified themselves with pictures: a boot for a cobbler, a key for a locksmith, and a barrel for a tavern. You didn't need words, you needed recognition. Medieval branding was aggressively visual. Even noble families used symbols: coats of arms, seals, and crests. These weren't decorations, they were legal tools. A wax seal stamped with a family symbol could validate a document without anyone needing to read it. Break the seal, and you break trust. This system worked surprisingly well. It allowed a largely illiterate society to function with contracts, trade, and law through shared visual language. Identity wasn't spelled out, it was shown. So medieval people didn't sign their name because they couldn't. They marked themselves because that was enough. In a world built on memory, reputation, and witnesses, a simple symbol could carry the weight of your entire life. Death in the medieval world was common, familiar, and deeply unsettling. Not just because people died young, but because nobody was entirely sure when someone was actually dead. Medical knowledge was limited. Diagnostic tools were non-existent. And are they breathing? It was the gold standard of confirmation. This uncertainty created one of medieval society's quiet, persistent fears: being buried alive. Comas, fainting, hypothermia, shock, and illness could all mimic death. If someone stopped moving, breathing shallowly, or responding, the conclusion was often made quickly, especially during plagues, winters, or famines, when bodies needed to be dealt with fast. And yes, mistakes happened. Stories circulated of coffins being opened later, with scratch marks inside, and of bodies discovered twisted, moved, or clearly panicked. Whether all of these stories were true or slightly exaggerated didn't matter. The fear was real, and it spread. As a result, medieval people developed contingency plans. Some requested delayed burials, insisting their body be watched for days. Wakes weren't just social rituals, they were observation periods. If you moved, twitched, or made an alarming noise, congratulations, you were not dead yet. Others asked to be buried with objects. Bells, ropes, or signals weren't widespread until later periods. But the idea was there. People worried. They planned. They negotiated with death like it was a slightly unreliable employee. This fear also affected burial practices. Graves were shallow. Coffins were simple. In some cases, bodies were buried directly in the ground, which was horrifying in its own way, but at least made escape theoretically possible. The bar was low. Religious belief made things worse. Being buried alive wasn't just terrifying. It risked dying without proper rites. No confession, no final prayers, no clean spiritual exit. That possibility haunted people far more than physical discomfort. So medieval people didn't just fear death. They feared premature certainty. They feared silence mistaken for stillness. They feared sleep mistaken for eternity. And in a world where the line between life and death was thin, blurred and poorly lit, that fear made uncomfortable sense. It's easy to imagine medieval life as an endless parade of suffering. Dirt, disease, danger and despair were stacked neatly on top of one another like a historical misery sandwich. And yes, life was hard. Painfully hard. But what often gets lost is that medieval people weren't walking around in a constant state of despair, clutching their heads and waiting for the next disaster to arrive on schedule. Most days were ordinary, and ordinary medieval life was quietly absurd. People laughed, they joked, they gossiped, and they complained about neighbours, weather, prices, and authority enthusiastically. Medieval humour was blunt, crude, and extremely unfiltered. Marginal doodles in manuscripts include fart jokes, animals wearing clothes, monks doing questionable things, and drawings that raise deeply uncomfortable questions about the artist's state of mind. Festivals existed everywhere. Saints' days, feast days, market days. Any excuse to stop working, eat too much, drink something questionable, and forget responsibilities for a while was embraced. People danced badly, they sang loudly, they mocked authority figures with jokes that were just subtle enough to avoid punishment. Even hardship had routine. Famine wasn't a constant emergency. It was something people planned around. Illness was frightening but familiar. Death was present but not paralysing. When everything is dangerous, you adapt emotionally, you don't survive. Absurdity became a coping mechanism. Naming tools, believing sneezes were dangerous, avoiding unlucky days, arguing with ovens, and emotionally assigning personalities to objects. None of this meant medieval people were foolish. It meant they were human in a world that offered very little certainty. They found meaning in ritual, comfort in repetition, and humour in exaggeration. When you can't control much, you control how you react. And medieval people reacted with creativity, stubbornness, and occasional nonsense. So medieval life wasn't a constant tragedy. It was a long improvisation, a mix of fear and familiarity, hardship and habit, serious beliefs and deeply unserious behaviour. People weren't waiting to be saved by progress. They were living day by day inside a system that made sense to them, even when it looked ridiculous to us. History remembers wars and plagues, but medieval people remember themselves through laughter, ritual and resilience. And that's the part nobody talks about because it doesn't fit the myth. In Tudor England, beauty was not a private matter, nor was it something a woman could define for herself. It was a public expectation, closely watched and quietly enforced. The ideal Tudor woman was meant to look a certain way, behave a certain way, and above all, signal virtue without ever speaking it aloud. Beauty functioned less as decoration and more as evidence of obedience, status, and moral reliability. Pale skin sat at the top of this hierarchy. A fair complexion suggested that a woman did not work outdoors and that she belonged to an indoor world of tapestries, prayers, and supervision. Darkness of skin implied labour, exposure, and therefore a dangerous proximity to independence. The sun, after all, was for peasants. Noble women protected themselves from it with veils, powders and wide sleeves, turning pallor into a visible badge of class. To look healthy was acceptable. To look robust was not. Softness mattered just as much. A Tudor woman was expected to appear physically delicate even if she was not. Rounded features, smooth hands and gentle movements were prized because they suggested a life untouched by strain. Strength, even when necessary, had to be carefully hidden. A woman who appeared too capable risked seeming unfeminine, and unfeminine women were treated with suspicion. Silence completed the image. The ideal woman spoke quietly, sparingly, and only when invited. Wit was admired in men and tolerated in queens. In ordinary women it was risky. A sharp tongue could easily be mistaken for ambition. And ambition in women was framed as a moral flaw. Chastity, therefore, was not only about sexual behaviour. It extended to speech, posture, laughter, and even facial expression.